The town of Wren Hollow wasn't much to look at from the outside. A cluster of aging houses, a main street lined with antique shops, and a diner that hadn't changed its menu since the Reagan administration. People in Wren Hollow remembered your grandfather's sins longer than your latest good deed. Reputation clung like humidity in summer, heavy, inescapable. Doreen lived on Sycamore Lane, in a modest two-bedroom house with chipping white paint and a porch swing that creaked more than it swayed. She'd been there for almost 25 years. Widowed young and left to raise her son alone, she became the kind of woman people in Wren Hollow whispered about, sometimes with admiration, sometimes with pity, but rarely with understanding. She kept her head down, worked quietly at the county clerk's office, and always paid her bills early. Doreen didn't have friends. Not really. Just Evelyn. But Evelyn didn't count as just. Evelyn was anchor, compass, and lifeline all rolled into one. Doreen had one son, Mark. He was born during a December blizzard so fierce that even the hospital generator failed for 2 hours. You came into the world in the dark, she would tell him on his birthdays, but you've always been my light. That was true, until the light turned cold. Mark had grown up with peanut butter sandwiches and secondhand sneakers, but never without love. Doreen packed notes in his lunchbox in elementary school, the kind with hearts and silly drawings. She skipped dinners so he could have seconds. She taught herself how to do algebra again at 10 p.m. just to help him finish his homework. She scraped every dollar to send him to a decent community college before he transferred and earned that golden acceptance letter from the University of Illinois. He never knew, not really, the things she gave up for him. She made sure he didn't. There was a moment Doreen often returned to in her mind, not because it was grand or traumatic, but because it was quiet, and in that quiet, she saw the truth of who they had once been. Mark was 10 years old. It was a Sunday in April, the kind of spring day when the air still has a bite but the trees insist it's time to bloom. Doreen had just finished hanging laundry when Mark came out to the yard, carrying a chipped porcelain teacup. "I made something," he said, beaming. "For you." He held out the teacup like it was made of gold. Inside was a wild bouquet, dandelions, buttercups, one rogue daffodil that had clearly come from Mrs. Langley's garden next door. The stems were uneven, the arrangement chaotic, but it was beautiful in the way that only a child's gift could be. Doreen knelt to his eye level. "You picked these for me?" "Well, I stole one," he grinned, not yet afraid of confession. Doreen laughed, genuinely. "It's beautiful, sweetheart." Mark's smile split his face. "You can put it by the sink, like the fancy flowers in magazines." She did exactly that. And for the next year, that teacup sat beside the kitchen sink, filled and refilled with tiny clippings from the world around them. Clover, wild mint, violets from the edge of the schoolyard. It became a tradition, unspoken. Mark never announced it, just kept refilling the cup, as if love were something you poured quietly, faithfully, without expectation. That cup was still there. 20 years later. Does he now? Forgotten. But not by her. What she remembered even more vividly was the day it almost broke. Not physically, but symbolically, when the thread between mother and son began to fray, subtle at first. It was Christmas Eve. Mark had just turned 32. The house was warm with spice and cinnamon. Evelyn had dropped off a casserole, and Doreen had set the table with her mother's old china, rose-rimmed, delicate, passed down through 3 generations. Jolene, Mark's wife, arrived late, hair curled tight and makeup flawless, her voice high-pitched and sugar-coated, like plastic wrapped around a knife. Mark walked in behind her, distracted, tapping something on his phone. "Dinner's ready," Doreen said, adjusting her pearl necklace out of habit more than vanity. "It's just pot roast. Nothing fancy." Jolene rolled her eyes. "We did keto for 2 weeks. This might kill us." Doreen smiled anyway. They sat. The twins, Mark's children, banged spoons and laughed. Jolene scrolled Instagram between bites. Doreen barely touched her food, watching, aching. She'd spent the whole week preparing. Bought the roast on sale. Dusted off the same candle holders from Mark's childhood. She even placed a tiny candy cane by each plate, tied with gold string. After dessert, store-bought pie Jolene brought, just in case. Doreen raised her glass of cider and said, I just want to say something." Everyone half looked up. She smiled. "Mark, I hope this year brings you peace, joy, and no more hardship. I pray nothing bad finds you in the new year. That you're protected. That you remember," her voice caught just a little, "that you're loved." The words hung in the air like frost. Mark stood up and slapped her. The room gasped, but no one moved. The sound wasn't thunderous, but it cracked through Doreen's chest like lightning. Jolene blinked once, then sipped her wine. The twins paused, wide-eyed, then resumed their bickering as if nothing happened. Evelyn wasn't there that night. She'd had the flu. Doreen didn't scream. She didn't cry. She simply reached up, steadied her trembling hand on her cheek, and looked at her son. Not as a mother looks at her boy, but as a woman looks at a stranger. The moment passed. Mark muttered something, grabbed his coat, and left with Jolene and the kids. The door shut with a soft click. That night, Doreen didn't clean up. She sat at the table, staring at the china she'd set with such care, at the now cold pot roast and the broken candy canes. And she noticed the teacup. Still there. Still unbroken. She walked to it, picked it up with shaking fingers, and held it to her chest. It smelled faintly of old flowers and lemon soap. She remembered Mark's tiny hands offering it to her. His 10-year-old eyes filled with hope. Something cracked inside her then, not like glass shattering, but like the first splinter in a dam. "A warning," she whispered, not to anyone, but to the silence. "You used to bring me flowers." Then she set the cup back, gently, and went to bed fully dressed, still wearing her pearls, still reeling, still whole. But something had shifted. And from that night on, the teacup remained exactly where it was, not because of sentimentality, but because it had become a monument. Not just to what had been, but to what had survived. Doreen had, for decades, bent herself around the needs of her son. Smoothed the edges of every mistake. Offered love in silence. But that night, something inside her whispered, "No more." She didn't know it then, but that whisper would one day become a voice. A story. A reckoning. And the teacup would still be there. Watching. Waiting. Unbroken. The house had never looked more beautiful. Doreen stood at the threshold between the kitchen and dining room, smoothing the wrinkles out of the linen tablecloth for the third time that hour. The centerpiece, a ring of pine cones, cinnamon sticks, and ivory candles, glowed warmly under the low chandelier. She'd even pulled out the good silver, the kind that tarnished if you so much as breathed on it wrong. Everything shimmered like hope under candlelight. It was Christmas Eve, and for the first time in years, she had managed to gather everyone at the table. Mark and Jolene had arrived late, the kind of late that made you wonder if they debated coming at all. Mark kissed the air near her cheek while Jolene made a show of her new earrings, talking too loudly about their investment portfolio, about how the twins were so beyond public school now. Doreen didn't respond much. She was too busy watching Mark. He looked older somehow. Tired. More expensive, but less alive. His tie was perfect. His jaw was clenched. She had made pot roast with rosemary and garlic, sweet potatoes the way he used to like them, and her famous cranberry compote that nobody ever asked for but always finished. The table smelled like memory, and for a moment, just a moment, she believed they were a family again. Dinner passed in fragmented laughter and clinking forks. Jolene mentioned the lake house. The twins complained about the lack of Wi-Fi. Mark sipped his wine too fast. Doreen didn't mind. She had learned to absorb silence like insulation, to pack it in the corners of her chest where affection used to echo. After dessert, store-bought cookies from Jolene, just in case. Doreen rose from her chair. She adjusted her necklace, pearls her late husband had given her the day Mark was born. She reached for her glass of sparkling cider. "If I could have everyone's attention," she said, softly, though her voice was already fragile from holding in too much. The room quieted, reluctantly. "I just wanted to say thank you for being here. This year has been hard for many of us, and she glanced around, found Mark's eyes. "Mark, I hope this next year brings you peace and no more trouble. I hope nothing bad comes your way. I hope you're happy. Truly. That's all a mother can ask." A silence fell. Not reverent, more like the stillness before a storm. Mark's chair scraped back abruptly. He stood. There was a strange tightness in his shoulders. Then, as easily as someone swatting a fly, he lifted his hand and slapped her across the face. The sound was sickening. Sharp, loud, unnatural. Doreen didn't stumble. But she froze. Her glass didn't drop. Her pearls didn't break. But something inside her, something sacred, fractured. The air was sucked out of the room. Jolene raised one eyebrow and took another sip of wine. The twins glanced at each other, then back to their plates. No one said a word. Mark stood there, his palms still hovering in the air like it wasn't quite finished. For one suspended second, Doreen didn't feel pain. Not the physical kind. She felt confusion, embarrassment. Then, as her fingertips reached to steady her burning cheek, she felt something colder, deeper, a knowing. She looked up at him, not as a mother looks at her child, but as a woman looks at the stranger who's walked into her house uninvited. Mark didn't flinch. He didn't apologize. He didn't look ashamed. He adjusted his sleeve and sat down again as if nothing had happened. Doreen took her seat. Slowly, deliberately. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She didn't even excuse herself. Instead, she looked at the faces around the table. Jolene was now talking to the twins about skiing. Mark had picked up his fork again. The girls giggled over something on their phones. No one was coming to her defense. No one even acknowledged what had just happened. Doreen felt heat rise to her neck, not from pain, but from realization. These people, the people she had cooked for, sacrificed for, broken herself in two for, they no longer saw her. Not really. Maybe they never had. The dinner plates still glittered under the light. The roast was half-eaten. The napkins folded like swans. It was all still beautiful, but it felt staged now. Like a play after the final curtain has fallen. She reached for her glass again and took a long sip of cider. Her hands no longer trembled. "You used to kiss my forehead before dinner," she said quietly to Mark. "Even when you were taller than me. You never missed a Christmas Eve." He didn't respond. Or maybe he didn't hear her. Or maybe he didn't care. Doreen set her glass down and stood again. This time, no announcement. She walked to the kitchen and placed her hand on the counter, steadying herself. The porcelain teacup still sat near the sink, dusty, forgotten, but whole. She picked it up, held it to her chest like a heartbeat. That teacup had held every flower Mark ever picked for her. When he was 5. When he was 10. Dandelions. Violets. Bits of the world he gathered and gave to her, not because it was Mother's Day or Christmas, but because she was his world then. And now, on Christmas Eve, she had become invisible enough to hit. She put the cup back gently, as if setting down something holy. The music had stopped, Bing Crosby, or maybe Nat King Cole, somewhere during dessert. She hadn't noticed. In the living room, Mark's voice rose in laughter. Jolene followed with her syrupy chuckle. The twins were playing with the dog, squealing. But the only sound Doreen heard was the echo of that slap. And beneath it, the sound of her heart quietly rearranging its borders. She knew now there would be no apology. No redemption waiting in the wings. There was only the truth, naked and unforgiving. The child she had sacrificed everything for was gone. And in his place stood a man who no longer needed her, but who still believed she owed him everything. She walked back into the dining room. They all looked up briefly, perhaps wondering where she'd gone. Doreen smiled. A soft, strange smile. "I think I'm going to call it a night," she said. "Thank you all for coming." "You're not going to open gifts?" Jolene asked, eyebrows raised. "Not tonight." She picked up the plates, stacking them carefully, one by one. No one moved to help. When the table was cleared, she turned to Mark and said, "The world will be unkind to you in ways I can't prevent. I used to believe I could stop that. But I can't. And I won't try anymore." Mark looked confused. A little annoyed. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means this was the last Christmas I spend waiting for you to remember who I am." He opened his mouth, but she didn't wait. She walked to her room, shut the door, and let herself exhale for the first time in years. Outside the window, snow had begun to fall again. Quiet, steady, soft. But inside, a woman had stopped being soft. Inside, something long asleep had finally woken. Wren Hollow was a town where secrets were whispered more than confessed, and yet they spread like wildfire just the same. But there was one secret that had never made it past the threshold of Doreen's quiet little home, until the moment everything threatened to unravel. It had been buried for nearly 2 decades. Mark was 16 the night it happened. Tall for his age, too charming for his own good, with a grin that could buy him time and forgiveness. That night, though, no smile could save him. Doreen had been asleep when the phone rang, an old rotary model that shrieked like a banshee at nearly midnight. She jolted awake, heart pounding. Only 2 kinds of calls came that late, tragedy or trouble. It was both. "Ma'am," the voice on the other end said, calm but clipped. "Your son's been brought in. You're going to want to come down to the station." She remembered the drive. No bra, robe over her nightgown, slippers barely holding together. Her hands had trembled the entire way. Not from cold, but from something darker, dread that thickened with every passing street lamp. When she arrived, Mark was sitting in the back of the station. His hoodie looked too big on him. He wasn't crying, but his knuckles were white from how tightly he clenched the fabric of his jeans. Detective Holloway met her at the counter, his face unreadable. He was caught with a stolen PlayStation, 2 wallets, and a purse. "All from lockers at the YMCA," the man said. He ran. Didn't get far. "We found more things in his backpack. It wasn't just one mistake." Doreen had blinked. "There must be a misunderstanding." "There isn't," the detective said flatly. He explained the charges: intent to distribute stolen property, theft over state minimum, potential juvenile felony. Then he added, "He's looking at possible time, not detention, not counseling. He's not a kid in the court's eyes anymore." That's when her body stopped shaking. That's when a different instinct took over, colder, sharper. Not panic. Purpose. She had looked the detective straight in the eye and said something she never thought she was capable of. "It was mine." The man blinked, clearly thrown off. "Excuse me? I stole those things." "No, Mark." He was just scared and trying to help. "He didn't want to tell on me." Silence. The detective stared, incredulous. "Ma'am, we have him on camera." Doreen leaned forward, her voice low. "Then the footage is wrong." He sighed. "Do you realize what you're saying?" "I do." She'd never broken a law in her life. She hadn't even had a parking ticket. But in that moment, she threw herself into the fire and didn't flinch. Within hours, statements were written, fingerprints taken. Mark was released to Evelyn, who had shown up quietly and waited without question. Doreen was processed, though eventually, by the grace of a church elder who still owed her late husband a favor, the case disappeared. The file was sealed. Her record kept clean. Officially. But inside, something had changed forever. She never told a soul. Not even Mark. She told herself he didn't need the weight of it. He needed a second chance, a clean slate. So she bore it alone. Lost her job at the courthouse quietly months later, though no one ever said why. Just budget cuts, they told her. But she saw the looks. She spent the next year cleaning houses to keep the lights on. Mark eventually graduated, got a job, married Jolene, had kids. And Doreen kept pretending. Until one Thursday afternoon, years later, she stopped by Evelyn's place. The kind of visit she used to make every week, before life got too heavy. The kettle was on, the house smelled like cinnamon and old books. She hadn't meant to talk about it, truly. But her voice cracked somewhere between a sigh and a sip of tea, and suddenly the truth came pouring out like rain through a broken roof. "I took the fall for him," she whispered. "He never even thanked me. He never even knew." Evelyn didn't gasp. She just reached across the table and touched Doreen's hand, her grip steady. There was no judgment, only witness. That's when Doreen saw the blinking red light on the table, the old court-issued tape recorder Evelyn kept, "for memories," she used to say. It was running. "Evelyn?" Doreen asked quietly, more stunned than angry. Evelyn didn't flinch. "One day, you're going to need people to know." Doreen hadn't pressed stop. Hadn't even argued. She nodded, salt and shame filling her eyes. That tape lived in Evelyn's safe for 6 years. Until now. It was a week after the Christmas slap when Doreen found the documents tucked inside Jolene's tote bag. It had been left carelessly on the side table after Sunday brunch. She hadn't meant to snoop, but the bold black letters stared at her like a threat. Petition to appoint legal guardianship due to cognitive decline. Her name, Jolene's handwriting in the margins, symptoms of memory loss, prone to emotional instability, unsafe with finances. Doreen sat down. Her knees no longer trusted the floor. They were trying to erase her. Legally. Systematically. Piece by piece. She heard a voice outside, Mark telling the twins to hurry up. He laughed. The same laugh he used to give her after running into the house from school. The same boy. The same voice. Now weaponized by time and ambition. Doreen didn't cry. She opened the drawer in her sideboard and pulled out the key Evelyn gave her last year. The one to the safe. 2 hours later, she sat in the back office of Pastor Thomas's church, Evelyn at her side, the old recorder in her purse, the cassette tucked in a soft handkerchief. I need someone to remember who I really was, Doreen said to the pastor, before they finish rewriting me. He nodded slowly. They listened together. The confession. The arrest. The silence. When it ended, the pastor didn't speak. He simply stood and walked over to his file cabinet, pulled out a thick manila folder, and handed it to her. This is a template for revoking familial beneficiary rights in private trusts. Doreen blinked. I never said. You didn't have to. Evelyn leaned forward. You don't need revenge. But you deserve power. Doreen took the folder, placed the tape inside it, and breathed. For the first time in years, she felt like she was not the one losing something. She was reclaiming it. The night after Doreen found the guardianship papers was colder than usual in Wren Hollow. But the chill wasn't in the wind outside. It was sitting quietly in the kitchen with her, folded into the creases of her robe, sipping stale tea from a mug that still said "World's Best Mom." She hadn't told anyone, not even Evelyn, not right away. She needed time to let the betrayal settle into her bones. To feel the full weight of it, because for once, she wasn't going to bury it or sweep it away like broken glass. She was going to sit with it. And when she did, something remarkable happened. She didn't fall apart. No crying fits. No pacing the floor in her slippers. No dramatic phone calls or handwritten letters torn halfway through. What came instead was silence, steady, sobering silence. And from that silence, clarity rose like dawn over a long, dark field. She'd spent a lifetime believing that love was measured by how much you could endure. That the more she gave, the more she'd matter. That if she kept the fridge full and the calendar clean and the holidays perfect, eventually someone would say, "Thank you, Mom. I see you." But no one had said it. And no one would. Mark didn't remember the nights she skipped dinner so he could have seconds. He didn't remember the cold winter when the furnace broke and she moved them both into the kitchen, sleeping in front of the oven with the door open so he could stay warm. He didn't remember the year she sold her wedding ring to pay for his textbooks and told him she'd just outgrown gold. He remembered what was convenient, and forgot everything else. And now they were coming for her mind. She thought of the phrasing in the guardianship petition. Doreen is showing signs of decline. She stared at that sentence for hours, then whispered, "Decline from what?" What they called decline, she knew, was simply her silence catching up to her. She had grown quieter. She had stopped chasing. Stopped calling when texts went unanswered. Stopped offering to babysit when the twins came in like storms and left without a thank you. She had started preserving herself, and they called it deterioration. They wanted her quiet because it made them comfortable. And suddenly, she no longer had any desire to be comfortable for them. It was a Wednesday afternoon when the shift finally took form. Evelyn arrived with lemon bars and a Tupperware of her end-of-week chili, but she knew something had changed the moment Doreen answered the door. Her eyes weren't tired. They weren't angry either. They were clear. "You want to come in?" Doreen asked. Her voice wasn't sweet or apologetic. It was direct. Always, Evelyn said, stepping inside. Doreen led her to the table and slid a folder across the worn wood. Evelyn opened it slowly. Inside were 3 things: the guardianship petition, a photocopy of the taped confession transcript, a handwritten letter, untitled, unaddressed. She read in silence, and when she was done, she looked up. "You're ready," she said. "I am," Doreen replied. Evelyn nodded, then stood and walked into the hallway without asking. A moment later, she returned holding the small fireproof safe. "Do you want me to unlock it?" she asked. "No," Doreen said. "I'll do it." She keyed in the code. 12/19, Mark's birthday. That fact made her pause, just for a moment. But she didn't cry. She simply pulled the cassette from its velvet sleeve. "I want people to hear it," she said. "Not just in whispers. I want it on paper. I want it notarized. I want it real." Evelyn placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You want justice," she said. Doreen shook her head. "I want truth. Justice is optional. Truth isn't." The next day, Doreen walked into the same county clerk's office where she used to process land deeds and voter registration forms for 15 years. Mr. Langley, the same man who hadn't looked her in the eye when they let her go, was still sitting behind the desk. He blinked when he saw her, like a ghost had walked through the door. "Doreen," he said, standing awkwardly. "What can I do for?" "I need a notary." "And a witness," she said, her voice as smooth as aged wood. She pulled out the folder, opened the letter, handed over the transcript. Langley read the first few lines and paled. "You're saying this is you? That you confessed to?" "I'm not saying it," she replied. "I said it 18 years ago. I'm just putting it in writing now." "But why now?" Doreen met his eyes, and for the first time in all those years, she did not blink. "Because someone is trying to erase me," she said. "And I refuse to let the people I save turn me into a burden they can legally eliminate." He swallowed hard, then nodded. The papers were signed, notarized, and Doreen left that office taller than she had entered. In the weeks that followed, she moved with intention. She met with a lawyer. She revised her will. She established a trust fund for girls aging out of foster care. For someone, she told Evelyn, who might need a mother just long enough to become herself. She didn't tell Mark. Not yet. Not Jolene either. Instead, she spent her evenings listening to Ella Fitzgerald on vinyl and polishing the silver she would never use again. And one morning, while folding laundry, she caught a glimpse of herself in the hallway mirror. Hair graying, posture stiff, eyes wiser than they'd ever been. She didn't look weak. She looked finished, not with life, but with compromise. The day she told Mark was a Sunday. He came by unannounced as usual, expecting brunch and maybe a check, to float us until Jolene's next payout clears. Doreen made coffee, set the table with the simple plates. No rose china, no mimosas. Mark noticed, of course. He always noticed when comfort disappeared. "What's going on?" he asked. Doreen smiled, not coldly but honestly. "I've been quiet too long," she said. "I thought love meant keeping your mouth shut. Turns out, love without truth is just submission." He furrowed his brow. "What's this about?" She placed the folder on the table. "This is about the time I saved your future, and what you tried to do with mine." He flipped it open. Eyes widened. He went pale. This could ruin me," he stammered. She nodded. "It almost did ruin me. And you weren't even aware." He tried to talk, but she held up her hand. "I'm not asking for forgiveness, Mark. I'm not asking for anything anymore. I'm telling you, your story belongs to both of us. You can't edit me out of it." He sat back, speechless. And Doreen, sweet, quiet, sacrificing Doreen, stood. "I gave you everything," she said. "And now, I'm keeping something for myself." Then she walked out onto the porch, where Evelyn was waiting, humming an old hymn and shelling peas into a bowl like time wasn't passing at all. Doreen sat beside her. And for the first time in her life, the world didn't feel like it was resting on her back. It was behind her. And she was finally walking forward. The sun was soft that morning, spilling through the kitchen windows like honey. Doreen had been up since dawn, not from nerves, but from resolve. The tablecloth had been pressed the night before, a pale blue one with faded roses stitched in the corners. She'd laid out her good silver, polished the crystal glasses, and placed a single peach candle in the center of the table. It was a Sunday like any other, but everything was about to change. She wore a navy blue dress with a scalloped collar and a string of pearls Evelyn had helped her clasp just hours earlier. Her hands moved with calm certainty as she finished slicing lemon tarts and arranging the peach rosemary scones in a circular dish that once belonged to her grandmother. Every detail was perfect, but this time it wasn't about impressing anyone. It was a farewell, a soft rebellion dressed as grace. This was her day. Not Christmas, not a birthday, not Mother's Day. Just a quiet Sunday. But one she chose. She had made a decision. If they were going to rewrite her story, she would hand them the pen, with her truth already inked across the page. By noon, they arrived like clockwork. Jolene came in first, phone in hand, snapping a photo of the spread. "Oh my God, Doreen," she chirped. "You really outdid yourself this time." Mark followed close behind, sunglasses still on indoors, nodding toward his mother as if he were acknowledging a waitress. The twins barely looked up before plopping into chairs and asking if there was Wi-Fi. Doreen greeted them all with her usual calm. Not cold, but distant, composed, like a host in the final act of a play she no longer wanted to star in. Evelyn sat beside her, not as a guest, but as her anchor. She wore her good brooch and had brought a small black bag that never left her lap. The meal passed with the usual pleasantries. Jolene bragged about a new skincare line. Mark retold the same MBA story he'd shared a dozen times. The twins complained about a history teacher and laughed when one accidentally spilled water. Doreen poured more without blinking. She let them talk. She let them perform. Because she knew what was coming. When the plates had been cleared and dessert had been passed around, Doreen stood. The room hushed, automatically expecting some sentimental toast. She didn't hold a glass. She held a small stack of cream-colored envelopes. "I have something for each of you," she said, her voice even and soft. "A small keepsake. A memory. Something important." She walked around the table, handing one envelope to each person. Jolene. Each twin. They opened them curiously. Inside each was a photo of Mark, age 16, sitting in the police station, handcuffed. A copy of the original police report, petty theft, intent to distribute, and most damning, a notarized transcription of Doreen's confession, recorded the night she took the blame. It was not an accusation. It was a truth finally unboxed. The silence was stunning. It stretched and echoed. Jolene's hand trembled. One twin gasped audibly. The other just stared at the report like it might bite. Mark's face drained of color. His lips parted but no words came out. Doreen sat down slowly, folding her hands in her lap. She didn't say, "Now do you understand?" She didn't say, "I told you so." She said nothing at all. Because truth doesn't require performance. Mark was the first to speak. His voice cracked. What is this supposed to mean?" Evelyn finally looked up, her voice calm but heavy. "It means your mother is done being edited out of the story she bled for." Jolene laughed once, short, bitter. "This is insane. This is some dramatic stunt." Doreen met her gaze, steady and unflinching. "No, dear. This is documentation. This is proof. Of what I did. Of what I gave. Of what I sacrificed." "But this was years ago," Jolene said, trying to gain footing. "You said it was a mistake. That it was over." Doreen nodded slowly. "It was over for you. For Mark. But not for me. Because I lost everything so he could have everything. And still, you came for more." Mark slammed the table. "This is twisted. You're making me look like a criminal to my own children." "You made yourself look like a stranger," Doreen said quietly. "I just stopped hiding the mirror." The room stood still. Even the clock on the wall seemed to pause. One of the twins, Grace, the younger, finally whispered, "Is this real?" "Yes," Doreen answered. "It's real. And it's done. I'm not asking for anything. I'm just setting the record straight. She reached into her own bag now, pulling out her final letter and placing it in front of Mark. He didn't open it, but she knew he would. Eventually, it contained a legal statement revoking him as beneficiary to her estate, a transfer of the house deed into a charitable trust, a final paragraph that read, "This is not revenge. This is remembrance. For the woman I used to be, before you all asked me to disappear." Jolene stood up. "You're doing this because of the guardianship petition, aren't you? You misunderstood. It was for your safety." "No," Doreen said, standing now as well. "You did it for your convenience. Because I stopped being your free childcare and started being a burden you couldn't monetize." Mark buried his face in his hands. Evelyn stood beside Doreen. She didn't need to say a word. Her presence was louder than any outburst. Doreen took one last look around the table. The same table where she'd cut birthday cakes, passed holiday stuffing, bandage scrapes, and taught multiplication over mashed potatoes. The same table where her sacrifices had been swallowed and forgotten like the very meals she cooked. This was the last time she'd sit here as a woman erased. She turned to go. "Wait, Mark's voice cracked. "Where are you going?" Doreen paused at the doorway, looked over her shoulder. "I'm going somewhere I don't have to prove I matter." Outside, the light was warmer than she remembered. Evelyn followed behind, steady as ever. Parked along the curb was a yellow cab. A single suitcase waited in the trunk. The wind smelled like spring, even though it was still February. Doreen stepped into the car, adjusting her scarf. "Where to?" the driver asked. She handed him an envelope. Inside, 2 cruise tickets. The Mediterranean. 2 weeks. Evelyn climbed in beside her. And as the car pulled away from the curb, Doreen didn't cry. She didn't look back at the house. She looked ahead. For the first time in decades, the road belonged to her. The ocean didn't sound like she thought it would. Doreen stood on the deck of the ship, the wind teasing strands of gray hair loose from the careful bun Evelyn had helped pin up that morning. The sea stretched endlessly ahead of her, shimmering like spilled silver, and for a woman who had spent most of her life in landlocked Wren Hollow, it felt like standing on the edge of everything she had ever denied herself. She closed her eyes. Beneath the rush of waves, she could almost hear the quiet of her old kitchen, the ticking clock, the hum of the fridge, the heavy silence that had filled the house long after laughter stopped visiting. But the memory didn't hurt this time. It felt distant. Something she had passed through, not something she was still living inside of. She was finally outside it now. The shift didn't happen all at once. It never does. Doreen didn't wake up one day with her spine straight and her voice clear. The transformation crept in slowly, like dawn through a cracked curtain. It started in the smallest places. How she poured her coffee, how she spoke to the cashier at the grocery store, how she looked in the mirror and stopped apologizing with her eyes. It was a Thursday when she realized she had stopped waiting for Mark's calls. She used to keep the phone close. Jumped every time it buzzed, hoping it was him. Hoping maybe he'd remember who she was before Jolene curated his memories like Instagram posts, filtered, flattering, and false. But one Thursday, the phone rang, and she didn't even look up. Because she was laughing at something Evelyn had said while they tried a lemon tart recipe neither of them knew would set properly. The laughter was light and full and spilled out of her like a woman remembering joy for the first time in years. That's when she knew. She was becoming someone new. Or maybe she was returning to someone she'd been forced to bury long ago. The cruise was Evelyn's idea. Take the freedom and go somewhere it doesn't need explaining, she'd said. Doreen had hesitated. She'd never been further than Missouri. She didn't speak any foreign languages. She'd never worn a swimsuit in public. But Evelyn had smiled and said, "Then it's about time." Now, for days in, Doreen had already fallen in love with espresso, linen skirts, and the way saltwater made her skin feel like it belonged to something wild. Each morning, she and Evelyn would rise early, walk the deck in quiet, and then split a pastry while the world around them slowly lit up. She had never felt younger. But more than that, she had never felt clearer. One evening, docked in a small Grecian village, They visited a local shop filled with hand-painted ceramics and embroidered shawls. Evelyn drifted toward a tray of olive oil soaps while Doreen found herself staring at a small display of hand mirrors, each unique, each holding more than just a reflection. She picked one up. It was round, with a golden rim and a single crack running through the handle. The shopkeeper noticed. "That one was dropped once," he said with a thick accent. "But we repaired it. With care." Doreen ran her fingers over the repaired crack, now sealed with a glint of gold resin. "It's still beautiful," she said. The man nodded. "More so, I think. It remembers." She bought it without hesitation. Back in her cabin that night, she placed the mirror beside her bed and whispered, "So do I." By the 7th day, something had settled into her chest, a kind of peace she hadn't known she was searching for. She thought about the old Doreen, the one who folded napkins with trembling hands, the one who wore pearls not for beauty, but for armor, the one who smiled through dinner parties where her own son made jokes at her expense while guests laughed politely and ached silently. That woman had waited to be seen, waited to be thanked, waited to be spared, and in all that waiting she had quietly erased herself, thinking that was love. But this Doreen spoke. She didn't need to raise her voice or slam a door. Her truth was no longer something to be hidden like a bruise under foundation. It was now inked into paper, spoken into tape, witnessed by Evelyn, notarized, and sealed. She had protected herself, finally. And the world had not ended. In fact, it had opened. One afternoon on the ship, a young woman, maybe in her late 20s, sat beside her at the railing. She wore a wedding ring and the tired eyes of someone carrying too much for too many. "Sorry," she said with a smile. "Mind if I sit?" "Of course not," Doreen replied, scooting over. They sat in companionable silence for a while. Then, unprompted, the woman sighed. "My mom passed last year. I still feel like I owe her everything. Like no matter what I do, it's never enough." Doreen turned to her. Her voice was soft but firm. "You owe her only what she gave freely. If she gave it with conditions, it wasn't love, it was investment." The girl blinked, then bit her lip. Doreen continued, "And if she loved you quietly, like most good mothers do, then carry her with grace. But never guilt. Guilt's no kind of memorial." They sat a moment longer. "Thank you," the woman said. Doreen smiled. "I used to need to hear those words from someone who never said them. So, thank you for saying them anyway." Back in her cabin that night, Doreen pulled out her journal. Not the kind with butterflies on the cover or inspirational quotes in the corners. Just a simple leather-bound notebook Evelyn had given her before they left. She wrote, "They will not write me out. I was the ink. I was the hand. And now I am the story." She paused, then wrote another line beneath it. "I did not stop being a mother. I started being a woman too." When the ship finally returned to port, and they walked down the gangplank with sun on their shoulders and stories in their bones, Evelyn leaned in and said, "So, what next?" Doreen laughed, adjusting her bag. "I don't know," she said. "But for once, it doesn't scare me." She turned to the open road, the wide sky, the life uncharted. And with each step forward, Doreen didn't feel smaller anymore. She felt whole. The house was nearly empty now. The rooms, once filled with the echo of family life, footsteps, slamming doors, the hiss of boiling pots, stood still under a soft morning light. Dust motes danced in the air, catching in the sun that fell through sheer curtains Doreen had never bothered to replace. There were no pictures on the walls anymore. No coats hanging in the hallway. No framed report cards. No "World's Best Grandma" drawings stuck to the fridge. She had packed everything that mattered into boxes and sold the rest. The china cabinet went to a pastor's wife. The antique sewing machine to a college student majoring in fashion. Even the old record player, Evelyn had cried when that left, was gone. What remained was Doreen. And her will. She sat at the kitchen table for the last time, reading it over one more time. The trust had been finalized a week ago. Every last cent, every asset, every piece of property was to be transferred to a scholarship foundation. One created in her name. One that would help kids like Mark used to be, brilliant but broken, lost but worth saving. She thought back to the first letter she had written to her attorney. I want the money to go where my love once went. Into futures. Not apologies. And that's exactly what she had done. She hadn't told Mark. Not directly. She didn't need another argument. Another lie dressed as concern. Another attempt to paint her as unwell, unbalanced, ungrateful for the family that had spent the last 5 years slowly chipping her out of their photo albums. Instead, she left the legal copy with Pastor Thomas, just in case. She knew Jolene would come sniffing around eventually. It had taken months. The sorting. The decision-making. The quiet undoing of a life constructed for others. At first, it had been painful. Every object held memory like static. Mark's first blanket, the gold earrings from her 40th birthday, the ashtray her husband had used before cancer took him. But the more she let go, the more she found herself, under the guilt, beneath the obligation. Evelyn had stood by her through every step. Not just with help packing or driving donation boxes, but with something deeper, witness. Everyone deserves someone to see them. And Evelyn had seen Doreen before Doreen had seen herself. You're not leaving a house, Evelyn had said one evening while they taped up boxes. You're leaving a cage. The taxi arrived at 9 a.m. sharp. A simple yellow cab, no limousine, no dramatic send-off. Doreen had never wanted attention. What she wanted was release. She wore her traveling dress, navy with a cream belt, and a soft cardigan that had belonged to her mother. Her suitcase was small, just enough for 2 weeks along the Mediterranean coast, where the salt hung in the air and the stars came closer at night. The driver, a young man with sleepy eyes and too much cologne, helped her load the single suitcase. Airport? He asked. Yes, she smiled, and then freedom. He chuckled politely, not understanding. That was okay. Doreen took one last look at the porch. The swing still creaked in the wind. The railing she'd painted after Mark's high school graduation was beginning to peel again. She didn't feel sadness. Not this time. Only gratitude for the years it gave her, for the lessons it etched into her bones. And then she turned away. The drive to the airport was quiet. Doreen watched the trees blur by. The town of Wren Hollow faded behind them. Its judgmental silences, its casseroles and gossip, its gentle indifference. She wasn't bitter about it anymore. She had simply outgrown it. She reached into her purse and pulled out a small envelope. Inside was a photograph, Mark at 5 years old, sitting on the floor, covered in finger paint, grinning like mischief itself. She had kept that one photo. Not because she missed the boy, but because she remembered how hard she had loved him. That love was real. Even if it had not been returned. Even if it had been rewritten. Even if it had been spent. She pressed the photo to her lips, folded it neatly, and slid it into the seat pocket in front of her. She no longer needed it. At the gate, she saw the sea for the first time from inside the terminal glass. It was vast and blue and waiting. So unlike the life she had known. The plane was on time. She stood with Evelyn at the boarding line. 2 old women, elegant in a quiet way. Passengers glanced at them, probably wondering if they were headed to a retreat, a funeral, a pilgrimage. They were headed to resurrection. Evelyn squeezed her hand. You scared? No, Doreen said truthfully. I've been afraid my whole life. I've finally stopped. You don't regret anything? Doreen thought for a moment. No, she said. Even the pain was part of it. It taught me the difference between loyalty and sacrifice. Between silence and peace. Between being needed and being known. They boarded together. Somewhere over the Atlantic, the flight attendant passed by with drinks. Doreen sipped sparkling water and stared out the window. The clouds were soft as sugar. The engine hummed beneath her feet. She opened her travel notebook and wrote, "The boy I raised is gone. The woman I buried is alive again. I gave everything I had to protect him. Now I protect me." She closed the notebook and leaned back in her seat. Sleep came easy. Back in Wren Hollow, days later, Mark would find the letter taped to the door of the empty house. It would read, "Mark, I never stopped loving you, but I finally started loving myself. What I gave was not a loan. It was a gift. And I forgive you. But I will no longer fund your forgetting of me. Goodbye, Mum. There would be no number, no address, just a name he no longer owned, and a future he had no access to. And for once, that silence wouldn't be her burden. It would be his. As the plane landed in Lisbon, Doreen opened the window again. The city was aglow with possibility. She turned to Evelyn and whispered, "This is where the story begins." Evelyn smiled. "No. This is where the woman gets to write it." Doreen stepped off the plane and into the light. And she didn't look back. There was a small coastal cafe in Sicily where Doreen liked to sit in the mornings, right before the heat rose and the streets filled with tourists. It was quiet there, shaded by olive trees and open to the sea. The owner, a woman in her 60s named Luciana, spoke only broken English, but they had an understanding. Coffee, no sugar, and the table near the stone wall, always. It had been a week since the ship docked. A week since Doreen officially stepped into a world that had no memory of who she had once been. A wife, a mother, a martyr of her own making. Evelyn was still sleeping back at the villa that morning. Doreen didn't mind going alone. In fact, she preferred it. She liked the sound of the waves brushing the rocks, the smell of citrus in the air, and most of all, the peace that had started to settle inside her like a long-forgotten melody returning note by note. She opened her notebook, the one she carried not to journal, but to witness herself. She wrote, "The version of me that never said no died quietly. And in her place, I have planted someone who listens to her own voice first." Doreen took a sip of coffee. It was strong and dark and slightly bitter, like truth. There had been a time in her life when sacrifice had felt sacred, and maybe in some ways it still was. But now she understood something she had never allowed herself to question before. Sacrifice without boundaries becomes erasure. She remembered a moment, long before the guardianship papers, before the slap at Christmas, even before the night she claimed Mark's crime as her own. It was when Mark was 12. They had just moved into their new house, her second job as a cleaner barely covering the deposit. The place was small, but it had a fenced yard and a school district she trusted. Mark had come home crying one day. He'd been teased at school for his shoes, hand-me-downs from a church donation box. He didn't want to wear them anymore. Doreen had quietly gone to her closet that night and taken down the coat her mother had given her. The good one, camel wool with satin lining. She pawned it the next morning and bought Mark a new pair of Nikes. He never asked where the money came from. He just smiled and ran out the door. Doreen stood at the window, coatless in November, and told herself, "This is what love looks like." And it was. But not always. Not when love required her to vanish, one item, one compromise, one dream at a time. Now, decades later, she could finally name the quiet truth so many women are taught to swallow. Love is not the same as self-abandonment. Love could be fierce and giving, but it should never cost your entire self. No one had ever told her that. Not her mother. Not her pastor. Certainly not the world. But she knew it now. She looked around the cafe, at the couples sharing pastries, the little girl laughing with her grandfather, the stray cat weaving between chairs. No one here knew her past. Not the nights she fell asleep crying over unpaid bills. Not the years she cooked holiday meals for people who rolled their eyes at her stories. Not the heartbreak of watching her sacrifices be minimized, weaponized, or, worse, forgotten. Here, she was simply a woman having coffee by the sea. And for the first time, that felt like enough. Evelyn arrived shortly after, cheeks pink from sleep and sun. She slid into the seat across from Doreen and smiled as if they had done this 100 times. "I always thought freedom would feel louder," Evelyn said. Doreen grinned. "Turns out it's quiet. Like a room you finally get to decorate with your own voice." They clinked cups in a toast without words. Then Evelyn leaned in, her voice softer. "You ever wish it had been different? With Mark?" Doreen considered it for a long time. She looked out at the water, where a small fishing boat bobbed like a toy. "I wish he had known how much I gave," she said. "I wish he had said thank you. Even once." Evelyn reached across the table and touched her hand. "But I don't wish I'd stayed," Doreen added. That version of love? The one where I disappeared so he could thrive? I can't carry that anymore. Evelyn nodded. You don't have to. After breakfast, they walked along the cliffside path lined with wildflowers. Doreen paused to pick a small yellow bloom and tucked it into the braid Evelyn had woven into her hair. A few steps later, a young mother passed with 2 children trailing behind. One child tripped on a stone and began to cry. Doreen bent down instinctively, her hands reaching to help. The mother smiled gratefully, muttered a soft grazie, and gathered her children. As they walked away, Doreen looked down at her hands. The same hands that had bandaged knees and packed lunches and wrote checks she couldn't cash. Hands that had held grief, folded laundry, turned pages of court documents. Hands that had been used by others. And finally, claimed by herself. That night, on the terrace, Doreen lit a small candle and wrote the last page in her notebook. Let them remember me how they want. But I will remember me like this. With salt on my skin, wind in my hair, and peace I did not borrow from anyone. She closed the book, set down the pen, and let the candle burn long into the night, its flames steady in the breeze. Sacrifice should never come at the cost of your soul. Doreen's story reminds us that love, real, enduring love, should never require silence, submission, or the erasure of self. It is noble to give, yes, but not to vanish. She taught us that letting go is not failure. It is often the first honest act of self-love after a lifetime of carrying everyone else. She reminds us, love is not the same as obligation. Peace is not found in being needed, it's found in being respected. And most importantly, you are not selfish for saving yourself. In your own life, there may come a moment when you realize someone has built their comfort on your silence. That moment will sting. It will shake everything you thought love meant. But when it comes, let it come fully. And then choose yourself. Whether you're a mother, a daughter, a friend, or a partner, your worth is not measured by how much pain you can endure, but by how well you can honor your own voice in a world that constantly tries to mute it. Speak your truth. Set the boundary. Take the trip. Light the candle. Write your name back into the story. You don't owe anyone the version of you they feel safest with. You owe yourself the version that feels free.